if we had the truth, do you think we could handle it? That's the age-old question, isn't it? And the governments in Australia in particular, Craig Heilmann asking the question, can the government actually tell the truth on something? I think that remains to be seen on both sides of the Tasman. Craig joins us now. Craig, kia ora. Can I just ask a question about what you're wearing? Now, for people listening to this on the radio, that'll be lost on them, but we're actually recording this, video recording it on Zoom as well. It looks like you're wearing like a Wallaby supporters jacket today.
Look, I'm not, and I wouldn't, because I'd be too embarrassed after everything that's happened. I don't even want to. I actually don't even know what you're talking about. What are the Wallabies?
It just looks like a green jacket with yellow piping.
No, if it is, it's South African, okay? It's not.
Okay, great place to start. But hey, jumping into Aussie politics.
Jumping, that's a pun, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Springboks, yeah. Jumping into Aussie politics, and it seems like the Aussies are in catch-up, not just when it comes to games played with an oval ball, but also in the topic of Indigenous rights. Now, there's a lot of debate on this side of the Tasman about co-governance and all those sorts of things. We're not going to have that debate today, but it seems not just a debate, but a referenda coming up in Australia on some of these issues. But just exactly what people are voting on, it's a bit murky, Craig.
It's really murky, Andrew. And the Prime Minister's pitched his tent on this. He's going, look, we're going to deliver for Aboriginal people in Australia. And he said, we're going to deliver everything the Uluru Statement from the Heart said, which was three pieces, really, which was a voice to Parliament, so a referendum that enshrines Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution, but says we'll actually give a voice to Parliament. So, the Aboriginal community can elect some people to speak to the Australian government, all the way down to what they call executive government, which is your top bureaucrats and departments, etc.
Yep.
That's number one. Number two would then be what they call a Makarrata Commission, which would look at issues of truth-telling. So it'd be dredging up the ugly history of racism or abuse or genocide or anything bad that's gone on. Now, I grew up in Tasmania myself. There are virtually no Tasmanian Aboriginals anymore. They're pretty well all been slaughtered years gone by. So that's an ugly piece of our history that there's no way avoiding. You've just got to accept that's what's gone on. Third piece of it is what we'd call a treaty, which is really the question of how do we settle, what is a settler state with people, the Aboriginal community that never agreed to being taken over by British settlement and the colonisation of Australia, and how do we then settle in terms of land, resources, that'd be the water and all the rest of it, same sort of stuff going on in New Zealand. And then, of course, what about reparations? And you've got all the Aboriginal activists on one side saying, look, there has to be a percentage of Australia's GDP which is paid to the Aboriginal community. Now, look, that's happening anyway, right? The Aboriginal community right now is getting about $40 billion a year Australian to have some of its social issues addressed, separate from all other stuff that goes on socially in Australia. So that's happening anyway, but it's a journey of three sort of stops. What's problematic at the moment is because people are being asked to vote on a referendum of a voice to Parliament, but everybody's recognising actually there's two other steps in the process, and I'm not sure I agree with those. But of course the government says we're not going to tell you about that, just trust us, and that's always scary when a government says trust me, and just vote for this voice and then we'll work out the rest of the detail. And so that's the problem. Will the government actually tell the truth to the public rather than just trying to con people into voting for things that then have massive repercussions down the track?
And now when we talk about the truth, I mean, it's the obvious truth, as you mentioned, that some horrific things were done to the Indigenous people of Australia years back, and that to an extent some of that still happens today. And looking at the statistics of how Aboriginal people are faring in terms of their incarceration rates and all sorts of statistics, there's obviously a problem there. And in some ways, something needs to be done about it. But I suppose if you're going to have a referendum, and I understand this is a binding referendum, Craig, so if you tick, if the majority of Australians tick yes, then some legislation's going to appear. But you don't know what you're saying yes or no to. You don't know exactly what this legislation's going to be that you're saying yes or no to, right?
Yeah, so it's going to drive constitutional change, which will be recognition of Aboriginals in the Constitution, that there's a 40,000 or 60,000 or however many year history before the settlement of Australia by white Anglo-Saxon colonisers, if you will.
Yep.
So there's that side of it, but then the other side of it is the voice to Parliament, the voice, the Aboriginal community speaking as one to, sort of the rest of Australia. Now, you're talking about 3% of people having a special say against 97%.
Yep.
This is not going down that well with people who might have immigrated in the last 40 years, let's say, to Australia, who go, well, I think I've got equal rights to being in Australia as anybody else. Now, do you measure the 40,000 years or do you measure the 40 years? Which is it? Do they both count? So that's one of the tensions here. But on the other side, you've got to do the right thing. You've got to do justice for the Aboriginal community. So trying to work those things out is a difficult balancing act. And like any form of politics, it's a question of justice, right? It's a question of fairness. How do we get there? But there is a feeling that because the government won't come clean and be straight with the public, that it's a bit of a stacked deck that's being played out here.
Yeah, and it's one thing, I suppose, to have a referenda, and as you say, there will be a process, there will be some level of consultation, and no doubt some debate about what type of constitutional change flows from here. But I suppose not knowing what you're voting for, that's what it comes down to. And behind that, I suppose, it is who do you trust? Who's telling the truth on this one? And when it comes down to the simple democracy of it, people being able to have a fair say and know what they're voting on, I suppose.
Yeah, so this is the odd part, is that the democracy side of it is in everybody voting for the constitutional change, but what we're voting for ultimately, or being asked to vote for, is something where one group of people are going to be enshrined with more rights than anybody else in Australia. And that's the odd part of this, because Australia's been working for 200 years to be essentially a colourblind state in terms of people's race or their history or whatever.
Yeah.
And now this is becoming central to the story that sort of postmodern Australia will have.
Yeah.
And so it's a tricky one. It's a really, really tricky one. I think as a Christian, you go, look, the history of what's happened to Aboriginal people in Australia is appalling.
Yeah.
And so you want to be on the side of doing something about justice and reconciliation, but it's knowing how to do that in a fair way. And you and I would probably share this view that, look, the more information the government gives, the better, because you don't want to do this under false pretenses. It can only lead to more bitterness and hardship down the track. And so reconciliation means all sides telling the truth. And I think white Australia has to accept the truth that there's been some terrible things done historically.
Yeah.
And we haven't been able to bridge the gap between, say, life expectancy for white Australians and Aboriginal Australians. So what do we do about that? On the other side, conning people into voting for things that they're not sure what the outcomes will be isn't going to be great either in terms of outcomes. And look, I'd maybe pose the New Zealand example as a case in point. A lot of people say in New Zealand today that the sort of co-governance message hasn't actually produced more racial reconciliation in New Zealand. It's produced a lot more tensions in some way.
Yeah, and there's ideology and then there's outcomes. Like, it's one thing to say, hey, we would love it for to live in a society where everybody, regardless of their background, had an equal opportunity to participate into society and there weren't any cultural barriers in them doing so. That's obviously not the case in New Zealand or Australia, but it also isn't clear that the solution is along the lines that is being suggested by the governments either in New Zealand or Australia. It isn't clear that, yes, the problem is clear, but it isn't evident that the proposed solution will actually solve the problem, or perhaps just benefit a minority of people and then not trickle down to those who are still marginalised.
Yeah, and that's the scary part, isn't it? That we could go through a lot of convolutions to try to change things and then realise that the average person who's suffering isn't being helped and their life isn't being made better. And that's ultimately got to be the goal here.
So in terms of, a certain amount of pushback, is it a given, as you said, the statistics are 97% non-Aboriginals in Australia? Do you think it's likely to be a landslide in one direction based on self-interest?
It should have been an easy one for the government. You know, if they'd simply gone for recognition in the Constitution and legislation of the other issues, they've gone for more than that. They've gone for a voice in the Constitution as well, which enshrines a sort of a racial minority right in the Constitution itself. That's made it more difficult. And then people dredging up questions about, well, what about treaty? What about reparations? What does that mean for me?
Yep.
If you go to an Aboriginal welcome to country ceremony at the rugby in Australia, let's not talk about rugby today, but let's bring up the recognition ceremony.
Yep.
You'll basically hear that this is land that's never been ceded. In other words, this belongs to us.
Yes.
So there is a sovereignty push to say basically every square inch of Australia belongs to somebody else. Now, if you're a landholder, the people that are voting against the voice in Australia are all people who are homeowners. They're not renters. They recognise that the question of ownership is actually on the table here. So my guess is that a lot of people are sort of scared about what it means long term in terms of who really owns the land. Now, I mean, that question of property ownership is a difficult one no matter what. It's a man-made thing, right? Nobody owns the land. God made it. It's God's,
Yep.
But at the end of the day, those sort of things become political hot potatoes. And that's what people are concerned about, I think, in Australia. But so at the moment, to get a referendum up in Australia, you've got to have more than, you've got to have more than half the states. You get a majority, 4 out of 6, and you've got to have majority of people as well in all the states. And right now, it looks like it's going down on both fronts.
Yeah, no, certainly. And honestly, trying to reverse engineer an Australian version of the Treaty of Waitangi 200 years too late. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense from a constitutional, or historical, or from a justice point of view, but recognising that, yes, something does need to be done in terms of rights and outcomes for all peoples in Australia. Craig, really appreciate your input. Thanks for joining us.
God bless, mate. Take care.